Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Our last episode, Dorothea and Will Ladislaw had met for the second time, and everything began on very friendly terms until Will confessed that he had a disagreement philosophically with his benefactor, Dorothea's husband. Now, it's a very short conversation that follows, and yet that doesn't give you the sense of proportion of the impact it had on both characters, because the impact it had on both Dorothea and Will quite clearly is big. And we'll begin, as usual, we'll read through the whole text now. We're getting to the end of chapter 21, and then I'll go back and we'll do all the commentary, any rabbit holes we'll pick up, etc. Before I start, though, can I just show off the bookmark that is in Middlemarch right now? The person who gave me this bookmark should recognize it, and that's my way of saying, it's great, it's living in Middlemarch, so it's going to have a long time home. But that's where it is right now. Okay, let's get started. I have heard Mr. Casaubon say that he regrets your want of patience, said Dorothea, gently. She was rather shocked at this mode of taking all life as a holiday. Yes, I know Mr. Casaubon's opinion. He and I differ. The slight streak of contempt in his hasty reply offended Dorothea. She was all the more susceptible about Mr. Casaubon because of her morning's trouble. Certainly you differ, she said rather proudly. I did not think of comparing you. Such power of persevering devoted labour as Mr. Casaubon's is not common. Will saw that she was offended, but this only gave an additional impulse to the new irritation of his latent dislike towards Mr. Casaubon. It was too intolerable that Dorothea should be worshipping this husband. Such weakness in a woman is pleasant to no man but the husband in question. Mortals are easily tempted to pinch the life out of their neighbour's buzzing glory and think that such killing is no murder. No, indeed, he answered promptly, and therefore it is a pity that it should be thrown away, as so much English scholarship is, for want of knowing what is being done by the rest of the world. If Mr. Casaubon read German, he would save himself a great deal of trouble. I do not understand you, said Dorothea, startled and anxious. I merely mean, said Will in an offhand way, that the Germans have taken the lead in historical inquiries, and they laugh at results which are got by groping about in the woods with a pocket compass, while they have made good roads. When I was with Mr. Casaubon, I saw that he deafened himself in that direction. It was almost against his will that he read a Latin treatise written by a German. I was very sorry. Will only thought of giving a good pinch that would annihilate that vaunted laboriousness, and was unable to imagine the mode in which Dorothea would be wounded. Young Mr. Ladislaw was not at all deep himself in German writers, but very little achievement is required in order to pity another man's shortcomings. Poor Dorothea felt a pang at the thought that the labour of her husband's life might be void, which left her no energy to spare for the question of whether this young relative who was so much obliged to him ought not to have repressed his observation. She did not even speak, but sat looking at her hands, absorbed in the piteousness of that thought. Will, however, having given that annihilating pinch, was rather ashamed, imagining from Dorothea's silence that he had offended her still more, and having also a conscience about plucking the tail feathers from a benefactor. I regretted it especially, he resumed, taking the usual course from detraction to insincere eulogy. Because of my gratitude and respect towards my cousin, it would not signify so much in a man whose talents and character were less distinguished. Dorothea raised her eyes, brighter than usual with excited feeling, and said, in her saddest recitative, "How I wish I had learned German when I was at Lausanne. There were plenty of German teachers, but now I can be of no use." There was a new light, but still a mysterious light for Will, in Dorothea's last words. The question how she had come to accept Mr. Casaubon, which he had dismissed when he first saw her by saying that she must be disagreeable in spite of appearances, was not now to be answered on any such short and easy method. Whatever else she might be, she was not disagreeable. She was not coldly clever and indirectly satirical, but adorably simple and full of feeling. She was an angel beguiled. It would be a unique delight to wait and watch for the melodious fragments in which her heart and soul came forth so directly and ingeniously. The Aolean harp again came into his mind. She must have made some original romance for herself in this marriage, and if Mr. Casaubon had been a dragon who had carried her off to his lair with his talons, simply and without legal forms, it would have been an unavoidable feat of heroism to release her and fall at her feet. But he was something more unmanageable than a dragon. He was a benefactor with collective society at his back, and he was at that moment entering the room in all the unimpeachable correctness of his demeanor, while Dorothea was looking animated with a newly aroused alarm and regret, and Will was looking animated with his admiring speculation about her feelings. Mr. Casaubon felt a surprise which was quite unmixed with pleasure, but he did not swerve from his usual politeness of greeting when Will rose and explained his presence. Mr. Casaubon was less happy than usual, and this perhaps made him look all the dimmer and more faded, else the effect might easily have been produced by the contrast of his young cousin's appearance. The first impression on seeing Will was one of sunny brightness, which added to the uncertainty of his changing expression. Surely his very features changed their form. His jaw looked sometimes large and sometimes small, and the little ripple in his nose was a preparation for the metamorphosis. When he turned his head quickly, his hair seemed to shake out light, and some persons thought they saw decided genius in this coruscation. Mr. Casaubon, on the contrary, stood rayless. As Dorothea's eyes turned anxiously on her husband, she was perhaps not insensible to the contrast, but it was only mingled with other causes in making her more conscious of that new alarm on his behalf, which was the first stirring of pitying tenderness fed by the realities of his lot and not by her own dreams. Yet it was a source of greater freedom to her that Will was there. His young equality was agreeable, and also perhaps his openness to conviction. She felt an immense need of someone to speak to, and she had never before seen anyone who seemed so quick and pliable, so likely to understand everything. Mr. Casaubon gravely hoped that Will was passing his time profitably as well as pleasantly in Rome, had thought his intention was to remain in South Germany, but begged him to come and dine tomorrow, when he would converse more at large. At present he was somewhat weary. Ladislaw understood, and accepting the invitation, immediately took his leave. Dorothea's eyes followed her husband anxiously, while he sank down wearily at the end of a sofa, and resting his elbow supported his head and looked on the floor. A little flushed, and with bright eyes, she seated herself beside him and said, "Forgive me for speaking so hastily to you this morning. I was wrong. I fear I hurt you and made the day more burdensome." "I am glad you feel that, my dear," said Mr. Casaubon. He spoke quietly and bowed his head a little, but there was still an uneasy feeling in his eyes as he looked at her. "But do you forgive me?" said Dorothea, with a quick sob. In her need for some manifestation of feeling, She was ready to exaggerate her own fault. Would not love see returning penitence afar off, and fall on its neck and kiss it? My dear Dorothea, who with repentance is not satisfied is not of heaven nor earth. You do not think me worthy to be banished by that severe sentence, said Mr. Casaubon, exerting himself to make a strong statement and also to smile faintly. Dorothea was silent, but a tear which had come up with the sob would insist on falling. You are excited, my dear, and I also am feeling some unpleasant consequences of too much mental disturbance, said Mr. Casaubon. In fact, he had it in his thought to tell her that she ought not to have received young Ladislaw in his absence, but he abstained, partly from the sense that it would be ungracious to bring a new complaint in the moment of her penitent acknowledgment, partly because he wanted to avoid further agitation of himself by speech, and partly because he was too proud to betray that jealousy of disposition which was not so exhausted on his scholarly compeers that there was none to spare in other directions. There is a sort of jealousy which needs very little fire. It is hardly a passion, but a blight bred in the cloudy, damp despondency of uneasy egoism. I think it is time for us to dress, he added, looking at his watch. They both rose, and there was never any further allusion between them to what had passed on this day. But Dorothea remembered it to the last with the vividness with which we remember epochs in our experience when some dear expectation dies, or some new motive is born. Today she had begun to see that she had been under a wild illusion in expecting a response to her feeling for Mr. Casaubon, and she had felt the waking of a presentiment that there might be a sad consciousness in his life which made as great a need on his side as on her own. We are all of us born in moral stupidity, taking the world as an udder to feed our supreme selves. Dorothea had early begun to emerge from that stupidity, but yet it had been easier to her to imagine how she would devote herself to Mr. Casaubon and become wise and strong in his strength and wisdom than to conceive with that distinctness which is no longer reflection but feeling, an idea wrought back to the directness of sense, like the solidity of objects, that he had an equivalent centre of self, whence the lights and shadows must always fall with a certain difference. Okay, let's go through the text. So we'll go back to page 207. If you've got a book with you, flip back there. And we're looking at that point at which Will realizes he's offended her. And I think that fact by itself marks Will out as one of the few characters in Middlemarch who have this perception. That is, they can clearly tell how other people are feeling, and then they make some adjustments in what they say or how they behave as a result. I think Will is one. I think Mary Garth might well be another. Now, we know who doesn't have this ability. We know that Dorothea doesn't yet. Not yet. Mr. Casaubon, absolutely not. Mr. Brooke, no. Rosamond Vincy, no. Dr. Lidgett, no. I did just think, now, Reverend Fairbrother, I think he can go into the same group. Will Ladislaw, Mary Garth, Reverend Fairbrother, people who, well, not only do they read others well, that suggests that they have a good understanding and awareness of who they actually are. They have that, and then they have the sensitivity to understand other people. And while Dorothea, yes, she's lacking in that area at the moment, later on in Middlemarch, she seems to get it. We will come to a passage when we get to page 733, where Dorothea will say, what do we live for if it is not to make life less difficult for each other? And then we come to this frustration, though, that Will does feel. It says it was too intolerable that Dorothea should be worshipping Casaubon. So the question is whether Will, in spite all his perceptiveness, has he perhaps made a slight misjudgment here or gone in with too much energy? The narrator's warning, he keeps using the word pinch. You'll see this on page 207 and page 208 uses the word pinch 3 times, as though Mr. Casaubon is nothing more than a tiny flying insect. But if, even to say that, shows that Will would understand, therefore, that Casaubon is very vulnerable. What he doesn't understand is that also Dorothea is vulnerable, because her image of Mr. Casaubon is very different. It's not flying, insignificant insect. It's something greater than human. And so I think it's interesting that Will thinks that what he's doing is I'll just nip a little bit of that. I'll just have a bite out of the edges of Mr. Casaubon's reputation with his wife. But he doesn't know that there's so little there that little pinch is enough to completely, it turns upside down her whole perception of her husband. We'll go on to page 208, and where you're probably expecting that a rabbit hole will open up, where Will Ladislaw makes the claim the Germans have taken the lead in historical inquiries. Well, here we could stop the meditations altogether, and we could start an entirely different line of education. And it would take us just as long as it would take us to finish Middlemarch, several years, while we look into this claim. It is a big uncultivated area for me, I'll admit. The knowledge that I have is like tiny pins stuck into a huge map. That's what it's like in terms of German Romanticism. And in fact, as a result of doing this meditation, I put a couple of books on my Amazon wishlist. I'm going to put one up on screen now that I'm going to buy. I think I'm going to hold off buying it until I've finished Keith Thomas's book, Religion and the Decline of Magic, because I suspect that this lovely volume is going to need just as much close attention as I'm having to give Keith Thomas right now. What it means is that I don't have much to add to Will Ladislaw's remark. He didn't really know a lot about all these German writers. That's what the narrator lets us in on sneakily. And I don't. We're perhaps on the same footing. I know enough to know that Will's statement is correct, but I don't know enough to elaborate on it. So, and what I did try to do as I was researching this meditation was I went on Google to try to even introduce you to some of the principal characters in 18th century German scholarship, so that I could go, okay, well, let's look at a few men, perhaps. But I'll just show you my browsing history. Okay, now you can just see that there were so many names, one on top of another, And because I knew them only sometimes by name, I really didn't know which of these should I introduce, how much more research should I do into what they wrote and what they thought about. And at the end, I just thought, wow, no, there's a whole world that needs to open up for me. And I'm very excited. We shall get started on that book on German Romanticism next year, I think. Perhaps what I can say with certainty is how strange is it that a man like Mr. Casaubon, who has time, who has money, and clearly has no problem with hours and hours of concentrated study, how could he choose to ignore the work and the scholarship of other people who've already investigated his subject areas? How? And the only thing that occurred to me was it really proves that Mr. Casaubon is not a great deal better than all the other Middlemarchers. I mean, that's what we've seen. If we can say one thing about Middlemarchers, it's that they just feel that everything's fine the way it is, and they have a grasp on the world the way it truly is, and they don't need any new ideas or things coming from outside Middlemarch, particularly from outside England. They don't need any of that. They're just self-sufficient and wonderful as they are. And it seems to me that Mr. Casaubon, even though he is better educated than many of the others in Middlemarch, he's not particularly less ignorant. And this tiny pinch that Will Ladislaw thinks is all he's doing, he's just diminishing Mr. Casaubon's stature in Dorothea's eyes. That's how he sees it. It's just taking a little bit away. It's just overthrown Dorothea's whole. She was already shaky, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The brick removed that brings down the whole house, and she's so overwhelmed by this realization that she has no energy. It drains her of energy. It drains her of the ability to think. She doesn't even think, as she might normally, to criticize Will for just being a little bit ungrateful, which he is a little, being a little bit ungrateful toward his benefactor, to speak critically of him in front of other people. She's just so overwhelmed that all she can do is just stare quietly. And at that point, Will knows, I really have done some damage here. And then Eliot's narrator has this beautiful way of describing what Will does now to try and make things up. He said he taking the usual course from detraction to insincere eulogy. And that's a highly decorated way to describe a less than honorable human behavior. And I hold my hand up. I've done it. You speak your mind about a subject, right? Or often about a person. And then you learn that the person you're speaking to feels very differently than you do. And depending on the social situation, now you've got to decide, do you continue to be frank, to be blunt and upset them with your words? Do you start a fight maybe? Because that might be what will happen. Do you make an enemy? Is that what you want to do at this point in time? A lot of decisions to be made socially in a very short period of time. And different people do different things. But there are times when you take the option to make peace. But that means you've got to be a quick thinker, and you've got to try and backpedal with your choice of words so that you effectively say something different than you started saying. And the other term that I wanted to focus on is Eliot's use of the term recitative to describe the outburst that Dorothea finally releases, her regret that she never learned German when she was attending school in Switzerland, because she could have done. Yes, she could have done. And now she can't be more help to her husband. I wondered why the musical description. A recitative in an oratorio. I understand they're also used in opera, but I don't know opera as well as I know oratorios. But in an oratorio, a solo singer will sing a short series of sentences or phrases, just a couple, but the music will have more the rhythms of speech than the rhythms of music. Music has more regular rhythms. Speech is a little bit different in its rhythms. And there isn't a repeated melody, something that you can recognize, and it's not a sing-along type of line of music. And the soloist typically is making a declaration of some kind, and it forms a bridge between the last piece that was listened to and the piece that's about to be performed, either by the soloist or by the chorus. The word worked for me because I had that knowledge. I thought, yes, because when I think of my favorite oratorio, everyone, if you want to know a little secret about me, if I look agitated or stressed, I can be calmed immediately if someone would just play Handel's Messiah from right through, from the beginning, to the very end, to the last Amen. There's something about, I sang that oratorio once way back in the 1980s, and so I know its rhythms and the exits and entrances of the various voices in the chorale, and it's comforting in a very strange way. But it just seemed to me that a recitative it's the beginning of a revelation. It's what the soloist gives is then filled out later by the message that comes in the subsequent piece. And I think this is true with Dorothea. What she's saying is revelatory. It changes something in Will's mind. Will suddenly realizes everything I've thought about her is incorrect. I thought that she must be disagreeable. I thought that she had a snide, underhand, and very clever way of putting me down. But none of that is true. He realizes that the woman he's meeting is just simple and full of feeling. There's no guile in her. She is an angel beguiled. She's just been fooled. She's been misled. But she's an innocent, beautiful, highly feeling creature. And then on page 209, Eliot continues this musical theme. She talks about melodious fragments. In fact, this point of the conversation, when Dorothea has realized what Casaubon might really be, and Will has realized what Dorothea might really be, I think if this were a film which would have an orchestral score, this would be the point when the music would have to lift and become more full, so swell and get louder as a way of indicating that both these people are now filling with a new knowledge, a new realization of how the world is that they did not have before. And it would have to have a sweetness to it, because within that revelation, on Will's part, there's much greater affection building. On Dorothea's part, there's a little despair. And what shall I do? And where am I? I don't know how you would combine those two things into one. Maybe you'd need two themes going on to reflect, but how they're these new realizations that they're having. And then Will starts talking about the Aeolian harp again. Do you remember when he first mentioned it? And that was back on page 80. When he heard Dorothea's voice, he knew nothing about her, but he still found her voice distinctive in a way. And so I had to go back, of course, and remember, what is the Aeolian harp again? And of course, it is a harp which is played by the elements. And I've put a link to a video in my description box. It's the same video that I would have put way back when we did that earlier episode in Loic. But you'll see that the strange, haunting music, the harp just sits there, and it's open to whatever the currents of air want to do, passing through and vibrating the strings. And I think so. He obviously feels that Dorothea is so pure and so wonderful that her voice is a channel. She doesn't speak so much for herself, but from something deeper or greater. And then that moment when the music lifts, somehow the music would have to change very quickly, because Mr. Casaubon enters. And that revelatory moment must switch over to something much more mundane. Will knows that he must go through the usual politenesses now of greeting his cousin. His cousin does the same, but we can tell, because the narrator tells us, that Mr. Casaubon gets no pleasure from seeing that Will is here, but goes through the motions of being scrupulously polite. And then he invites Will to dinner tomorrow, because that's a convention. Really, not because he really wants to, I don't think, but because it is a polite, upper-class Victorian convention that if you have met someone that you know and you can offer hospitality, you do as soon as you are able. So all that mundane stuff now out of the way. Dorothea and Casaubon are left alone. Dorothea apologizes, I think because she's realized, I hurt him this morning, and maybe more than I can understand. And he's clearly was affected by her words, because he's cut short the studies that even Dorothea thought he would be there all day, and now he's come back home. So obviously what she said distressed him greatly, and so much so that he can't concentrate. He couldn't even get any work done, so he had to just come back home. And I think what happens next is interesting, because she apologizes. He accepts that apology in an interesting way. Like he accepts it by saying, I'm glad that you apologized. Not saying, I forgive you. She has to ask him if he forgives her. But there we go. That's his psychology. I'm not going to comment on that more. But then in his mind, he's thinking, oh, I was going to tell her off for seeing Will Ladislaw by herself. She shouldn't have done that. That's what he feels. Now, we should explain that, because I found online sources which agreed with Mr. Casaubon. That is, they said that it was a breach of Victorian etiquette for a woman to meet alone with a man who was not immediate family, i.e. father, brother, husband, something that close. Anybody else you really weren't supposed to. But those sources, they're not primary sources. They're not even secondary sources. They're just online writers who are telling me they know how it was. When I actually found a transcript of an 1850s etiquette book on Project Gutenberg, I scoured it, everything to do with calling or paying visits, and I could not find any advice about what a woman should do if she's on her own in her house. Who might she invite into a room where the door is closed? That nothing is said. And the book did advise that a woman could call on a bedridden man and visit him in his bedroom. And of course, the implication that you read into that is that at any other time, visiting a man in his bedroom is out of the question. And so, and that sounds right for the time, but to meet a man alone in a room that is designated for visitors during the hours that you have visitors, the book doesn't mention that there's anything wrong with that. And that may mean one of three things, okay? It may mean that the social taboo about a woman meeting a man, and they're in a room together, they are not close relatives. It may be that the taboo was so strong that you didn't need to wait for an etiquette book. You didn't need to read your first etiquette book to know that that wasn't to happen. The behavior around you and the things that got frowned upon and the things that got reacted to would be such that you'd already know. There are some cultural things like that you can't get in books, because you simply have to grow up in the culture and people will let you know what is right and what is wrong. So it may be something like that. But you see, I doubt that Dorothea would have agreed to meet Will if the taboo was that strong. She is very strict on herself in terms of things that she considers moral. So I think if it truly was wrong for her to meet Will Ladislaw alone like that, then she would not have done it. She would have told the servant, I can't see him because my husband is not at home. The second possibility is that there was no problem with it in the 19th century, provided that the man and the woman are meeting in the daytime in a room in the house that is designated for receiving visitors, and the visit takes place during the normal hours for calling, which were usually sometimes later morning for close friends, but more likely they were mid-afternoon. That was when callers usually came round. Or 3, there was just no problem with etiquette at all. This is not an etiquette issue. And the reason Casaubon doesn't want Dorothea to meet Will Ladislaw by himself is for another reason. And maybe the novel hints at that on page 211, because it reveals that Mr. Casaubon has jealousy, real jealousy of Will Ladislaw. Now, at first I thought, is this sexual jealousy? I mean, we've already established that I don't think anything sexual is happening within this marriage. So I don't know if Mr. Casaubon is afraid that Dorothea will be attracted to Will, but maybe it's just jealousy. Maybe it predates Casaubon wanting to marry anyone. Maybe he's always been a little jealous of Will and the different way he tackles life. Mr. Casaubon is very duty-bound and and very constricted in what he feels he should do or must do. Will is much freer, much more open. Perhaps he dislikes that, or perhaps it's just because Will is not 100% English, and the whole issue with Will's mother marrying a Polish man, that this was scandalous enough within the Casaubon family for her to be completely disinherited. And perhaps what Casaubon fears is that Ladislaw will be trying, by one means or another, to get himself the inheritance that his mother was denied. And there is another sentence on page 211 that really captured me. It was when Eliot's narrator says, "Epochs in our experience when some dear expectation dies or some new motive is born." And I wonder what kinds of experiences Eliot was thinking of when she wrote this. I wish I could ask her. Honestly, because she and I have one thing in common. We were both fervently religious in a way that was out of balance. I mean, I think I can speak for her as well as myself. Out of balance. A religious devotion that was too naive, too simplistic, and too inclined to take people as being almost divine in their level of infallibility, right? Yeah, all the qualities that are just doomed for self-destruction. And I just wonder if she was thinking back to that experience. Actually, Joseph Francis Burton, if you happen to be watching this video, can I ask you a question? Because you read everything George Eliot has written. Did she ever talk about her experience of losing her faith? Like something internal that she did. What exactly ended her belief, and how did she experience the end of that epoch herself? What was it like when she went from being a fervent nonconformist to a skeptic with the determination, to stop attending church, even if it meant upsetting her father? And for Dorothea, I just wonder if this is the beginning of many changes. We shall see. She's certainly recognizing now that Mr. Casaubon, the reason he can't respond to her with feeling is because there may be something very broken and not right within him. And so for her to expect love from him, to expect shows of affection or feeling is just completely misled. We don't know exactly what Casaubon's need is. I kind of wish we do. I kind of wish we knew his past, what his parents were like. Something about emotional expression frightens him, and that suggests that at some time in his life he was punished for showing feelings of some kind, and somehow he's taken this project of his and he's used it as an alternative means to get what he needs. So substituting the acclaim that he imagines he will get from a scholarly reading audience, and also the uncritical admiration from his new wife. He's using these things as ways to get the emotional satisfaction that he's actually denying himself. No glowing review of his book or no amount of silly flattery from Dorothea would actually satisfy that need. And before we close, I want to reread the last paragraph of the chapter, because I was so impressed by Eliot's almost breaking down of human emotional development. Again, a little bit ahead of her time. Let's reread. We are all of us born in moral stupidity, taking the world as an udder to feed our supreme selves. Dorothea had early begun to emerge from that stupidity, but yet it had been easier to her to imagine how she would devote herself to Mr. Casaubon and become wise and strong in his strength and wisdom, than to conceive with that distinctness which is no longer reflection, but feeling, an idea wrought back to the directness of sense, like the solidity of objects, that he had an equivalent center of self, whence the lights and shadows must always fall with a certain difference. What's being said here? You're really breaking down kind of 3 stages of human emotional development. And I might refer a lot to my notes and look down more than usual, because I really want to get this point across. 1, the phrase where Eliot says, taking the world as an udder to feed our supreme selves. Well, that's a good description of how we are emotionally when we're babies and very small children. That's why children are impossible to reason with, because they don't see the universe consisting of lots of people with needs just like their needs, feelings just like their feelings. They don't see that. They just see themselves. And others they're something else. And that said, most children will develop some natural empathy just through social experiences. And then parents and teachers, we get in there and we try to tinker with that a bit more, develop it a bit more if we can, And then, of course, they learn from social taboos and etiquette, and that those etiquette points often restrain them and make them act empathetically, even if they don't feel very empathetic. And I think this is where Dorothea was before her big realization in this chapter. It says Dorothea had early begun to emerge from that stupidity. Well, I think what that means is she understands the social conventions, and she's also added some strict religious conventions which have altered her behavior. But as the paragraph suggests, they've not necessarily altered her ability to perceive her own selfishness, and therefore she did not, up until that point, truly see other people in the same way she saw herself. She knew her own emotional needs. She knew that she was this great well of need. It never occurred to her that someone like her husband was another well of emotional need, but he wouldn't necessarily demonstrate that in the same way she does. And then finally, Eliot's narrator talks about that distinctness which is no longer reflection, meaning other people, if you mature emotionally and spiritually, other people are not just, you don't see them just as reflections of what you want from that person. That's how Dorothea saw Casaubon, didn't she? Before she married, she saw Mr. Casaubon not as an individual to be understood for himself, but as a reflection of her own needs and desires, didn't she? She wanted freedom. She wanted the ability to exercise her intellect and to do something good for the world. And she married Mr. Casaubon so that he could give her those things. She didn't marry him because she understood him as an individual and said, yes, that's the person I fit with. That's the person I understand and can give something to. She wanted something from Mr. Casaubon. And you can say conversely, Mr. Casaubon married Dorothea, not really seeing her as an individual, but seeing what she could do for him. And this third state where distinctness stops being reflection, where you start understanding that everything that you feel inside you exists inside another person in the exact same way to some degree, but also with differences in light and shadow, that whatever it is they've gone through has molded their little selves as well. And it's, I suppose, the height of psychological development when you understand that all other people around you are also little egos that are learning and finding their way out of that egoism and learning to understand how to interact with other people. And I think it's wonderful how she lays that out. She can do that every once in a while in a random paragraph that just seems like a little comment before the end. I'll just wrap up here. But what she says could be, you could go to Piaget or one of these other developmental psychologists and find that they probably echo a lot of things she's saying here back in the 1860s. And so that's another meditation done. We're going to start chapter 22 next Sunday. So bring yourselves and get ready for that. In the meantime, hope your reading is going really well. And I'll see you again. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.